So he starts reaching for a pocket, and I just get super hyper focused on what he's reaching for, and I see him pull something out. And as he's starting to pull it out, I start slowing down, start reaching for my gun, thinking, no, no, no. And the next thing I know, he has a gun pointed at me and he yells, freeze. And kind of at that exact second, everything is a bit of a blur. I had talked with members after the fact saying, like, I couldn't have told you what color my gun was, how many rounds I fired, but I just drew my gun and started firing.
Bend, don't break. This is a Delta Police podcast.
Hear more about how police officers strengthen their resiliency through the power of story.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Bend, Don't Break. And this is an episode I've been trying to do for a significant period of time, and we just haven't been able to connect with Brad Savage and I. So today is finally the day, so I'm thrilled to be able to have Brad on. But before we get to Brad, I received an email from one of our listeners that I thought it would just be important to mention, and it's about the podcast, but really I want to be able to thank the team that puts this podcast together. So the email goes something like this. My name is Melanie, and I'm a provincial training officer for the Natural Resource Officers Ministry of Forestry. I just wanted to reach out with a quick thank you. There's so much value to sharing these stories, and although you are typically hosting first responder types, our uniformed officers are hearing the key messages of wellness, resiliency, and the importance of consistent self-care. I can't tell you how impactful and helpful it is to refer members to your stories. So it was my opportunity to be able to take that little bit of an email that I had and be able to say thank you to our team. Our team works exceptionally hard to be able to put this podcast on, and it takes them away from their daily duties. So I'm grateful for the work that they do. So a big shout out to our team, and now to more important pieces around Brad Savage. Brad, welcome to Bend, Don't Break.
Thank you for having me.
Thrilled to have you here. And Brad, tell us a little bit about where you're working right now and what you're doing.
I'm currently posted to Fort Nelson, BC, so right in the top northeast corner, and I'm the supervisor of BC Highway Patrol. It's a 4-man unit, and we cover 1,000 kilometers of highway up to the Northwest Territories border, the Yukon border, and then we cover halfway to Fort St. John.
That's a lonely job, Brad, and you were referred to me by another one of our frequent listeners and obviously our frequent podcast guest, Mark Bouchard.
Yes, he's a very good friend.
Oh, wonderful. Well, great. Well, tell me a little bit about your history, Brad. Tell me about where you started with policing and how you got involved in this wonderful profession we have, this most noble of professions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was kind of born into the career, I guess. My dad was our CMP. I was born in Vernon and grew up in Ontario and New Brunswick. So I kind of grew up through all of my dad's transfers. And then I joined the RCMP in 2009, so I have almost 15 years now, and this is my 5th post in just over 14 years, so I've been in 2 different posts in Nova Scotia, 2 isolated posts in the Northwest Territories, and then here in BC.
You know, I'm always so amazed. I speak to many RCMP officers, and just the resilience and the challenges of moving so many times and keeping a family unit together is just absolutely incredible. And that's an additional stressor that certainly in the municipal police departments we don't face to the same level for sure.
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky. I'm married with 4 kids, and we treat it as an adventure. It's a benefit to us that the RCMP is so wide that my career pays me to let us travel this country and see different places, and the cultural experiences that my kids have been able to have in just a short amount of years compared to most people in their entire lives has been pretty incredible. So.
Absolutely, and I can't think of a better way to be able to deal with some of the complexities around moving across the country and many, many times, other than to be able to think about it as an adventure. That's certainly the way to go on that. Now, I know that when we talked previous to this is that you have faced some critical and challenging issues, and we're going to talk about your story of resilience and your story of how you've maintained your self-care and self-wellness. But tell me about some of the incidents that you've been involved in and sort of how you found yourself in sometimes a very dark place.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first started in kind of big city policing in terms of the East Coast. I was in Cole Harbour, Nova Scotia. But my go-to person was my dad. He was a member, so I could give him a call and say, "Hey, I was at a bad domestic. I was at this bad call, or I was at a shooting." And I'd say he was what I now use a psychologist for, without knowing what that terminology was or what that looked like. And then in 2015, my dad passed away after his third bout of cancer, and I lost that outlet. And because I didn't know that it was an outlet, I just thought, well, okay, I can't share it with my family because I don't want to scare them. And it wasn't really acceptable at work to say like, hey, this call really upset me, because you don't want to look weak or afraid to other members. So that's kind of 2015 is when it was like, okay, I'll just start bottling stuff up, and I'll keep it to myself. And that's when things started to go downhill. And then as bad calls started to happen, that's when things started to build up from there.
Are there any particular calls that you remember that sort of stick in your mind and were ones that you found particularly challenging?
Yeah, I had one. I was in Fort Good Hope, so it's a community of about 600 people in the Northwest Territories. It was a phenomenal community that we absolutely loved, and it's where I fell in love with community policing. I coached volleyball there and was involved in the community any way I could, whether it was at the community hall or just stopping in and seeing elders. And I was really lucky to coach the senior boys volleyball team there. And the boys started calling me dad. And for a lot of them, I was kind of their only father figure that they had. And it started off as a joke, and then they just kind of all would always call me dad, whether it was when I was at work or in the public or anything. Until one night, one of the boys got high on drugs, possibly some bad drugs, because he had a really bad reaction to it. And he got a hold of a gun and was saying he was going to shoot people. And I remember my partner and I being drawn out on him. And basically, if he turned a couple inches, I was taking a shot before he could shoot somebody. And when we arrested him, he was yelling, "Dad, Dad, you can't do this to me, Dad." And I remember that one hitting so deeply, that this was one of my kids. This was one of my volleyball kids. And to hear Dad as he's kind of crying to me about what's going on and what he's going through, that I just had no idea how to process it. We didn't really There were some mechanisms in place that, if I said, "Hey, I need help," that I could have gotten the help, but that would have meant either transferring or being flown out of the community. And again, it was one of those things like, well, if I say I need help, then that means there's something wrong with me. And so it was just, no, keep quiet and just keep pushing. But that one stuck with me. I still have a bit of a reaction to it, and that's with years of working on it. But that one was definitely one of the ones that really, really hit deep for me.
Now, there's a number of things that I think are worthy of sort of unpacking there, or at least pulling the string on. And the first thing would be that at that particular time, there was still a significant stigma around officers reaching out for mental health wellness. Certainly in northern communities, I would think it would even be more isolated and worse than it might be in a larger city. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. You have to do a Northern Medical to get up north, and the idea of saying, "Hey, I need help," could mean your Northern Medical's pulled, and if that's pulled, then you no longer have a job up in the north. And so that meant everything. That meant my livelihood. That meant my job, and what my life looked like up in the Northwest Territories.
And secondly, when you were up in the north as well, what were the access to services like? You know, was there lots of services there, or would you have to be flown out to be able to get some of those services and help?
So immediately thinking as a member, I would have told you, "Oh, no, there's nothing available." But that's also because it's really easy to do this and say, "No, I'm on my own,
Right
and
on.
there's nothing available, and nobody cares." But there's lots available, and my thought process of, "Oh, like they're gonna pull my medical and they're gonna kick me out of here." That's the immediate fear that we as members think, well, we're just gonna get kicked to the curb and be on our own. there were a lot of supports. There were ways to do it through like how we're doing it, through video conference or be flown out, that surprisingly, if you ask for help, there's lots of options for it. It's just that immediate fear, or most people only hear about the one worst case scenario where a member gets put off work. And that's the one story that's spread everywhere of, well, if you ask for help, this is what's going to happen to you, is this one member. And not, no, actually, there are ways to get help, and you can talk to a psychologist and can get better.
Absolutely. Now, the second question would be, how available would peer support be, or was there systems in place at that particular time to be able to get assistance within the organization with your colleagues?
So currently I'm peer-to-peer, and I'm what's called PSRT, Proactive Support Response Team.
Amazing.
Then at the time, if there was anything like that, I didn't know about it. I'm not going to say there was nothing, but it definitely wasn't advertised to any extent to kind of the isolated communities. And I know there was a big kind of revamp of what peer-to-peer looked like for the RCMP kind of all across the country. Because I was lucky enough when I moved back to Nova Scotia to be part of the new peer-to-peer group and what that looked like. But at that time, I don't believe there was anything.
Sure, and that brings up just another point on that, is that we have come a long way in relation to how we make our officers and our first responders aware of how there is peer-to-peer counseling and peer-to-peer cooperation and support. But the other piece on that is that a lot of that as well takes a separate angle, in that the member themselves or the officer or employee themselves have to reach out and find those resources. So you have to go hunting for those resources. And we're going to talk a little bit about another resource that you had during your journey as well, I know, as we get further down into the podcast. Now, this was sort of the first of many sort of critical incidents that had a huge impact on you. I know there was another one that we talked about that you wanted to talk about as well.
The one in Nova Scotia?
Yes, you bet.
Yeah, so there was kind of a personal incident that happened in 2018, and then my work incident 3 months later in 2018 was just a routine traffic stop on the highway in Berwick, Nova Scotia. It's a tiny little community in between Kingston and New Minas, right around Wolfville, just west of Halifax. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was out looking for impaired drivers. Stopped a vehicle for doing 120 in a 100 zone and a burnt out headlight. And I'd done 2 or 3 traffic stops before then and did them all the time. This was nothing out of the ordinary. Went and talked to the driver, could smell alcohol, detained him and got him out of the vehicle. And kind of luckily, through previous experiences, I walked behind the driver instead of beside him, because I've lost impaired cases for somebody staggering because I walked next to them. And as he was walking, he had his one arm didn't swing, only one arm swung. And initially I just thought, okay, he has drugs or alcohol on him. But it was just some red flags were going off, but I wasn't terribly worried, but it was just enough of a concern that when we got to my police truck, I said, for officer safety reasons, I'm going to search you. And the driver started getting kind of really whatever with me. And I just quickly keyed up on my radio asking for another unit. Luckily, the watch that I was on, I had been there since May or June. I had just moved there from the Northwest Territories. But the guys had known me enough that I kind of I was used to the North. I was used to being on my own, and I kind of handled traffic stops on my own, and that if I was calling for backup, it was serious. And being right in Berwick, I was kind of in the middle of 2 detachment areas, being Kingston and New Minas. And so a member from each office started making their way to me. So I talked to the driver, told him, look, quit messing around, whatever you have on you. I'm going to find, but if you keep messing around, I'm going to arrest you for obstruction. And for a second, he relaxed, took a deep breath, and went, okay, fine. And as his shoulders dropped, I kind of went, okay, good. He's gonna listen to me. And he put his hands back up on the passenger window of my police truck. I went to search him again, and he lowered his arm, and I went, okay, that's it. You're under arrest for obstruction. He turned into that same arm and faced me, headbutted me in the chest, and then pushed off of me, more to get distance away from me than to actually push me away. And every part of me wanted to tackle this guy into the ground, and I started going towards him and noticed he started reaching for a pocket. And he's what in the RCMP world we call a depot nightmare, because he was wearing all Carhartt. So he had a Carhartt jacket and Carhartt pants on, because in our training scenarios that's what the bad guy wears, because if we use simulation rounds, the Carhartt is a thick jacket that helps protect the actors in this situation. So he starts reaching for a pocket, and I just get super hyper focused on what he's reaching for, and I see him pull something out. And as he's starting to pull it out, I start slowing down, start reaching for my gun, thinking no, no, no. And the next thing I know, he has a gun pointed at me and he yells freeze. And kind of at that exact second, everything is a bit of a blur. I had talked with members after the fact saying, like, I couldn't have told you what color my gun was, how many rounds I fired, but I just drew my gun and started firing. My immediate memory at the time was I thought I shot 6 rounds, and I ended up shooting 13, and had moved kind of in a crescent moon shape behind my police car and away from him, out kind of into the middle of the highway, and he was on the shoulder of the road. Where we were was kind of the highway is built up about 12 feet above farmers' fields. And I ended up being super threat asphyxiated on the gun. The end of that barrel looked like it was the size of a watermelon. And I remember that was the only thing I could see. And I could tell you from training that training says aim for center of mass. And that's where I thought I would have shot if that's where I was aiming. But I know my eyes were only focused on that firearm. And of the 13 rounds, 1 hit the driver, and it went right through his gun hand. Again, just kind of explaining how threat asphyxiation works, and that's all I was doing was looking right at that gun, and that's where my rounds were going, were straight towards that gun. So he ended up turning around and running down into the ditch and then out into the field. There was maybe 3-4 inches of snow on the ground. I remember kind of running to the shoulder of the road to go after him, and then realizing, wait, I can't go after him because there's a passenger in the car. And then kind of going, what do I do? Like, I can't go to the passenger because the driver's out in the field, and I can't go to the driver because of the passenger. And then it kind of hit me like, none of my coworkers know what's going on. Like, the last thing I said was, can I get another unit? So I hit the 1033 button, our emergency button on our radio, and just start yelling for help, that shots were fired, that there's a male running through a field. And it's pretty crazy. I've read, especially since then, but prior to that, I had read a few books and audio tapes about memory and the order of things happening. I didn't get to listen to the 911, like the dispatch audio recording, until a full year after it happened. And the order on the recording is different than my memory. And I remember I thought the staff sergeant that came on the radio asked me to check on the passenger, but I had already done that and then told the staff sergeant on the air that the passenger wasn't doing anything. And I repositioned myself on my own into the opposite ditch, because the one thing that call really made me realize is, up until that point, I loved my emergency lights. People on a traffic stop would always go, oh, they're so bright. Like, and I'm like, yeah, that's perfect. But on this call, they blinded me, because when the driver ran down into the field, I lost sight of him right away because my own emergency lights took away my night vision and I couldn't see him. And I was getting lit up like a Christmas tree from my own emergency lights, that it just makes me super aware that they're both helpful and not all depending on the scenario. And it was just incredible how training kicked in. I did a tactical reload because I couldn't remember how many times I fired. So I took the used mag, put it in my pocket, put a new mag in my gun, and waited for backup to show up. I ended up being in the ditch by myself, waiting for backup for 6 full minutes, which felt like an eternity. And I remember the most calming sound in the world being my partner's siren off in the distance because I wasn't alone anymore.
Yes. Before we go into sort of the impacts of that personally and for your wellness and sort of some additional incidents that you faced, maybe just tell us how that situation concluded.
Yeah, so he ended up getting caught by our ERT team and was placed in jail. As it went to court is when COVID happened. So when it was going to court, the defense counsel was asking for time served, and our Crown was asking for 10 years jail. But basically, Crown was like, you need to prepare yourself that he might walk out on the day of sentencing. And he never got charged. The gun was found, but it was found unloaded, so he was never charged with attempt murder. I think the heaviest charge was assault on a police officer, and he had firearms prohibitions and stuff like that. But it was a pretty crazy feeling to think he might just do like a year in jail after what I went through and get out, but trying to prepare for that. And then because of COVID, I read my victim impact statement by myself in a courtroom that was completely empty, except for me and a court clerk. The judge videoed in from a different courtroom, and the Crown and defense and accused videoed in from a different area. And I remember the first appearance date, there were 8 members that showed up there for me. And I was like, oh, you guys don't have to be here. And I took it for granted. I thought like, oh, like, thanks for being here, but like, it's not necessary. And then flash forward to like it being adjourned, and 6 months to a year later, reading that impact statement by myself in a courtroom. I wished for those members to be there and to have that support. But it ended up being that he got 5 years jail, which, given the circumstances, was better than anything. Was still tough to deal with, because of how personally invested I was with it. That it was like I know I could have lost my life on the side of the road, and that only means 5 years jail to somebody that's a repeat offender. But I've done a lot of stuff since then to take care of me, that me trying to hold on to any grudges or, this guy should have rotted in jail longer, is me drinking poison hoping somebody else would die. And I've basically just let go of everything with Dari, the driver, and he can live his own life, and I do mine. And I've let go of so much just carrying around weight because of it.
Now, I want to talk a little bit. I know there were some other critical incidents, including the death of your niece, that was very impactful for you. But I want to talk a little bit about what finally sort of was the straw that broke the camel's back, to say, in relation to you knowing that you needed to be able to do something about your resilience and your wellness.
Yeah, so I'd say it probably started with my shooting, that it was kind of just expected. Like, okay, well, now you've been in a shooting, like you have PTSD, and that's it. It was kind of pushed on me more than anything. I remember talking with the force psychologist about returning to work, and a psychologist isn't allowed to book you an appointment because of kind of their licensing. They're allowed to give you a list of psychologists. And so I remember calling kind of 5 or 6 on the paper, and all of them weren't taking new clients. And I remember crumpling the sheet of paper up and throwing it away because just to make that phone call is saying I need help as a police officer that only helps people and doesn't need help themselves, or so I thought, was really, really difficult. And my wife came and uncrumpled the sheet of paper and kind of put a magnet on it and put it on the side of the fridge. And for me, it was me snapping at the kids, them laughing or making noises, even them just having fun in the house, but it being noisy would really start to set me off. And I would snap. I'd be like, no, enough. And my wife would be like, they're just having fun. And I'm sorry, I don't care. Like, it's got to stop. And so she'd kind of grab the sheet of paper and just set it on the table. And I was like, okay, and kind of take a deep breath and realize like that I overreacted to the kids just laughing. And so I called, I think there was 13 numbers on the list. So I called the remaining numbers on the list, and all of them weren't taking new clients. So I emailed the psychologist saying, like, look, like, I was involved in the shooting. You gave me this list and none of them are available. Like, can you make a phone call and get me an appointment? And she replied back with like, no, I can't, but here's another list with 6 more numbers. And so I brought it home, set it down on the table, but was like, no, I've already called enough people, like, and kept getting this mindset of like, you know what, if somebody doesn't, like, I tried, and if someone doesn't want to help me, then clearly I don't need help. And then it would take me snapping at the kids again for my wife to slide that paper to me again. And I remember calling all 6 of those numbers, and none of them were taking new clients. And I ripped the sheet of paper up and threw it in the garbage and looked at my wife and said, and if you tape it back together, I'm going to rip it up again. I said, nobody wants to help me, so I guess I don't need help. And I had gone back to work. I was off from December 11th to January 2nd. And I went back to work and I attacked it at, I refuse to let this scare me. I refuse to let this bother me. So I took as many overtime shifts as I could. I took as many calls as I could. And the more calls you take, the more kind of high risk files you end up going to. And so I ended up completing a few more at what's called SBORs, subject behavior officer reports. And luckily, Ottawa has a red flag system that after so many SBOR reports done for one member, you get a meeting with your sergeant. And I'd say that was probably the complete turning point with me, was the sit down with my sergeant. And he was super open about his mental health, about going to see a psychologist, that he himself was involved in a shooting when he was junior in service. And he's like, I can't really ask you this, but Brad, you're going to see a psychologist, right? And I was like, no, I called every single number and no one's taking clients. And he gave me his card for his psychologist. He's like, this is my psychologist. I will call her and make sure you have a spot, but call this number, get an appointment, and I will make sure you have an appointment. And so I called that afternoon and I got an appointment the next week. And that's kind of what started it. But then the fear of, if I open up to her, she'll take my job away, is where it started, that I was filtering what I was telling her. So that's where the help started, but that's not where I started helping myself.
What's interesting on that is that what prevented you from talking to your sergeant about this beforehand?
That's a good question. Probably my ego. Like, for me at the time, if you said, from working in the small communities where you're identified as a cop first, like, that's the new cop in town. And even my wife, like, that's the cop's wife. Those are the cop's kids. Like, your identity becomes your job. Where in a bigger detachment, in a bigger city center, I can arrest somebody and never see them again in my life.
Yes.
Where my identity became a police officer, whether I was in uniform or out of uniform. So my guard came up higher and I was kind of always on duty. And so even transferring to a bigger center, it was still, I'm a cop first. So it's, I'm Brad the RCMP. Oh yeah, and this is my wife and kids. And it was my identity first was I'm a police officer. And so the idea of saying, hey, I'm not doing so good, or hey, I need help, meant my whole entity as a character was in question. Like I was questioning who I was. And I think I could have that battle with myself in the comfort of my home with my wife, saying, okay, I'll deal with this on the side when I'm not working and I'll call for help, but I can't go to the guys at work because then they might not give me the overtime shift, or they might not look at me as the go-to guy for a call because I'm switched on and ready to go. That I think I personally took it as a weakness, and it wasn't cast by anybody else. It was 100% self-created by me, that I might be thought of as less.
Sure, a limiting belief, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I know that you were now seeing a psychologist and you were only telling part of the story and the story you wanted her to hear. And tell me about sort of the journey that goes from there, about how you actually find a more open environment to be able to talk and then find some of your own resources as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember doing the PTSD questionnaire with my psychologist, and I remember telling myself, "There's no way I'm putting a 5. I might not put a 4, and we're gonna like lower stuff as much as we can." Um, and I remember getting the results back, and she's like, "You're right in the mid range, but you're at the high mid range." And I remember thinking to myself, like, I lowered a lot of these, like that's not good. But I was like, okay, and kind of I think I was going once every 2 weeks with her, and it would just be kind of talk about the stress of the last 2 weeks. But time we talked about the shooting or my niece or like any of that stuff, I kind of fluffed it over. Like, no, I'm good. And I remember my psychologist challenged me on it once, saying, Brad, either you have an extremely optimistic outlook on things or you're really good at disassociating. And that was kind of the first time I had heard that term. And because to me, I always kind of thought, like, why be upset about something when you can just kind of push it off to the side and just go amongst your day? Like, no one else wants to hear that you're having a shitty day when you can just kind of fake it till you make it and keep going.
Yes.
That's when I realized pretty quickly that I'm very good at disassociating and can kind of push stuff back and pretend it doesn't exist really, really easily. And kind of the changing point for me was the peer-to-peer program being revamped in Nova Scotia. You had to apply to the program and kind of write an essay as to why you thought you were a good fit for the peer-to-peer program. And I kind of laughed to myself thinking, like, well, if you want an essay on like trauma and how I can help, like, here you go. And so I applied, and I got one of the peer-to-peer positions, and we got extra training, like assist, and I forget if it was SISM or what it was, but there was extra training on how to take care of yourself. And then the kind of head corporal for the peer-to-peer program offered me a Wounded Warriors course called TRP1, Trauma Resiliency Program. And I was like, okay, I'll I'll try it out. Like, I can't say like I'm this mental health guy and want to take care of myself if I don't go to one of these courses, so I'll go try it. And the Wounded Warriors program is absolutely incredible, completely covered for, I know it is for all our CMP. I don't know how it is for the other police departments. But I flew out to Cornwall, Ontario. It was in the NAV Center, and it was a 5-day long course. And it was ran by a psychiatrist and psychologist. And to me, that was where everything changed, because they couldn't take my job away. The only thing they could report on was if I was suicidal. And I was like, okay, so in that 5 days, I got so much out of that program because I talked about what bothered me. I talked about what I was getting stuck on and how my emotions were, and just how everything impacted me. And that was kind of the realization of, okay, I need to do better. And there was a gentleman who I would have been late 20s at the time, and there was a gentleman next to me that was about 20 years older than me. And what he said kind of slapped me in the face. And he said, after the fourth wife, I realized it was probably me. And that hit me so hard because I realized how much I had taken advantage of my wife and kids because I just knew they would be there. I just said I treated them however I wanted to or snapped at them when I wanted to and then went to work because my wife would always be there. She took care of everybody and I took that for granted. And that was kind of the wake-up call for me of I need to smarten up or she's not going to always be there because she doesn't need to put up with this. And I'm amazed she did for as long as she did. And so for me, it was, okay, if I can get this much in 5 days from talking to psychologists that I've never met before, then I'm going to go back. And I did. I went back and apologized to my psychologist, told her I had lied on all my PTSD questionnaires and had been disassociating and had been kind of lessening the impact of everything bothering me. And we redid the PTSD questionnaires. And within a week, I think, of that course, my psychologist diagnosed me with PTSD. And for a lot of people and a lot of different podcasts that I hear, that PTSD diagnosis was like, wow, it's like a relief to people. And for me, it was like this punch in the gut that it was like, I could have been that 35-year member that just ignored it and hid it. And I went looking for it. Like no one was like, hey, you need to do this. I went looking for it. And it was just that, like, what did I do? Now I'm flagged with this diagnosis. Now how are people going to look at me? And luckily I worked with some amazing people that were an incredible support for me. And now I get to do stuff like this with you and advocate for how PTSD is a very small symptom of the sacrifice we make for work and not a determination of the character of who you are as a person. But I have my family because of it, because I don't ignore how I feel. I don't push away feelings and just bottle stuff up until I explode. And the relationships I now have because of it are incredible. So that would be how everything switched for me.
I want to come back to sort of where you're at now and what you have going on going forward. But before I do, I think there's some important things is that many of the guests that I've spoken to and the people that share their story, they have a learning experience and their journey involves actually participating in a process where they think they're going to help other people. So by you joining the peer-to-peer group, you actually were able to go to the Wounded Warriors course. And as a result of that, you had you really did find some way to be able to assist in your overall wellness and resiliency. And I think that's very common, is that people that experience trauma, experience significant issues, do have that want or that need to be able to help others who may be experiencing something similar. That's so valuable. And the second piece is I do believe the Wounded Warriors courses are very, very good, and they certainly have the ability to be able to transform people. And like you say, PTSD is a diagnosis, but most people grow from the experience as well. And I think that's where I'm leading now, Brad, is that you can talk a little bit about where you are now and how you've actually grown from your diagnosis of PTSD and its post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've kind of gone after any mental health course that I possibly could. I was really lucky and went on a course down in the States called Save a Warrior. And I'm now the Canadian ambassador for them and trying to build up funding to open it back up to Canadians. It's currently closed because all of their funding is from the States. But it's a course largely based on the ACEs score, which is Adverse Childhood Effects, and how trauma as a child and trauma as an adult can mesh together. And that course for me changed absolutely everything, and really saved my life in terms of how I looked at things. I would have always told people I wasn't suicidal because my idea of suicide was holding a gun to my head. But instead, I had a lot of suicidal ideation of, well, my family's better off without me, or if I just wasn't here, they'd do better, or if I, got killed at work or got killed in a crash, they'd be better. And those are all the same thing, just different levels of what that means. And so that course really started to change the way I looked at things, and it introduced meditation for me. So I meditate on a regular basis and do a lot of reflection stuff, and that just gets rid of that kind of anger or that edge of when the kids are running around acting crazy, that it doesn't really bother me anymore. I don't get me wrong, I still have my bad days. I've done the trauma resiliency program number 2 through Wounded Warriors. I've also done the an equine therapy couples course through Wounded Warriors with my wife, and my kids have done the Warrior Kids program through Wounded Warriors. And that course was incredible. It's two sisters that run the Warrior Kids program, and they actually made a kids book about it, about what a it's called an invisible injury, but essentially what PTSD is. And I remember my youngest daughter Willow was 8 at the time, and she read the book with my wife. And I remember thinking this course was going to be like my kids telling me, like, you're a bad dad, you need to do better. And I'd helped sign them up for it, but was just worried that it was going to be bad. And so my daughter read this book with my wife, and then she had questions for me. So I go up and talk to my daughter, and she said, Dad, what did you want to do when you were little? What did you want to be when you grew up? And I said, I wanted to be a basketball player. I wanted to be in the NBA. And she said, okay, well, could you have gotten an invisible injury if you were a basketball player? And I said, well, maybe, like, probably not, but maybe. And she goes, well, you have an invisible injury now? And I said, yeah. And she goes, well, why would you have a job that could give you an invisible injury then? And I said, well, because I want to help people and I want to keep everybody safe. And she just said, okay, and like was completely fine with it and had no concern with it whatsoever. Meanwhile, I'm ready to like burst out crying because my daughter has challenged the very reason why I have my career and why I do what I do and why I every day go do a job that can literally change my brain permanently for the way of what I'm going to see. And she had no problem with it. That completely figured everything out for her. And just being open with them. I've talked with a lot of friends that kind of shield their kids and shield their family, and to each their own for their decisions. But with technology and society today, their fears of what can happen are greater than what's actually going on. And for me, just talking to them openly about, like, yeah, there are these dangers, but I work with these really great people that are going to protect me, and I have all these tools that can keep me safe, and you can message me anytime and you can see that I'm safe and doing this, that yeah, I try not to bottle anything up, and I try not to kind of keep anything closed off either, because I find that just makes me go back to the way that things used to be. And yeah, I do general maintenance all the time. So every 4 to 6 weeks, I go see a psychologist. And what that looks like for me in Fort Nelson is driving 6 hours each way to Grand Prairie, Alberta. So it takes 2.5 days to do. We do a day of driving with the whole family, half a day for appointments, and then a day of driving for the whole family to come back. And yeah, it's what it takes to take care of everybody, and that's it's worth every bit. It's my general maintenance. And next week I head down to the States to go back to Save a Warrior again, because I do shepherding. So it's someone that's been through the program that helps the guys that are going through the program again, and kind of going back into that program and giving back to helped me so much is really, really good for me.
Well, it's clear to me you've made a very conscious decision to take care of yourself and to take control of your life and to make sure that you provide yourself the maintenance, as you called it, to be able to make sure you are always well for your work and for your family. If you were to want to leave our audience with anything, what would you want to leave them with today?
Just how important it is to take care of you. When I first started with peer to peer, it was so easy to put everything I needed on the side to help somebody else. And that's really beneficial to help other people. But it's okay to be greedy. It's okay to take a sick day. It's okay to take time off. And it's more important to take care of you. You have to fill your cup first. And the way I'm able to help people now, because I take care of myself more, is way better than what I've ever been able to do first. So my advice would be to be greedy when taking care of yourself first.
No, that's great advice, and certainly we know that from being on planes where they tell us to put our oxygen mask on first and then care for those around us. You're right on. We cannot look after other people to the extent that we would like to our full extent, unless we take care of ourselves. And, I've got to start by thanking you for being able to share your journey, a very vulnerable journey, about how you've gone through these critical instants in the work that you do and your relationship with your family, but found a way that you can maintain a high level of balance within your life, both work and career and family, and be able to continually learn. And that journey is never ending. And I think that's a really clear message for us is, number one, take control of your own life and make sure that you're looking after yourself first, because that's the way you can best look after others. And that journey never ends. It's continual. As you say, every 6 weeks you're on the path to Grand Prairie, and that's not an easy drive. I know that drive. And certainly that's a commitment you make to make sure you take care of yourself. So I'm grateful. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And I just wish you great success with your family. And please keep on learning and keep on sharing with first responders.
Thank you, Neil. I will.